want to make our own cars. We don't really want cars from Canada.
It's been a common refrain from the president.
They would, let car companies leave here and go to Canada, but that hurts the United States.
A line Donald Trump has repeated multiple times since returning to the White House, viewed as an ominous sign ahead of free trade talks. But a new report from the Wall Street Journal shows the Americans might be backing down on cars. The Trump administration is expected to propose that 50% of components of any automobile need to be U.S. made to qualify the product as tariff-free. That might sound like a lot, but the Canadian Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association says that's already happening.
In 2019, the average U.S. content in a Canadian vehicle is 38%. Using U.S. data, we crunched the numbers, and that number at the end of 2024 was 50%.
Something big is happening in North America's car industry, and Canada could come out stronger than many expected. A new plan is putting pressure on car makers to rethink where they build and buy parts, creating a surprise opportunity for Canada. While others see problems ahead, this move could open new doors for Canadian factories and workers. The Trump administration formally presented its opening position on automotive content rules to Canada and Mexico ahead of the July 1st CUSMA review deadline. The proposal demands that vehicles qualify for tariff-free treatment only if they contain at least 82.5% North American content, up from the current 75% threshold, and, crucially, that at least 50% of a vehicle's total content must be produced specifically in the United States. 2 days before the July 1st deadline, the proposal landed in Ottawa and Mexico City and immediately drew pushback from both governments, industry associations, and automakers operating integrated manufacturing operations across all three countries. The current CUSMA automotive rules are already among the most demanding content requirements in any trade agreement anywhere in the world. When the agreement replaced NAFTA in 2020, the North American content threshold was raised from 62.5% to 75%, a significant increase that required substantial supply chain restructuring across the continental auto sector. The current rules also include a labor value content requirement mandating that at least 40% of vehicle content be produced by workers earning at least 16 USD per hour. That combination of high regional content plus wage floor requirements was itself the most stringent automotive sourcing framework in modern trade agreement history. The new American proposal adds a country-specific U.S. content floor of 50% on top of those existing requirements. The structure of the North American automotive supply chain makes the 50% U.S.-specific content requirement the most operationally disruptive element of the proposal. A modern vehicle assembled in Ontario, or Michigan, or Monterey, contains components that have typically crossed the US-Canada or US-Mexico border multiple times during production. An engine block may be cast in Ohio, machined in Ontario, assembled into a drivetrain in Michigan, and installed in a final assembly plant in Alabama, each border crossing adding value while the part remains within the same production network. The CUSMA rules were specifically designed to accommodate this integrated production model by measuring North American content cumulatively rather than requiring each individual component to meet country-specific sourcing thresholds. A 50% US-specific content requirement would force automakers to track and verify the national origin of content at a granular level that the current cumulative regional content framework does not require. Supply chain restructuring to meet that threshold for vehicles currently assembled in Canada or Mexico would require either moving manufacturing operations into the United States or paying tariffs on vehicles that cannot meet the new standard. A report by the Anderson Economic Group, cited by Reuters, estimated that the Trump administration's tariffs have already raised auto costs in the North American market by more than $100 billion. The proposed CUSMA content changes arrive on top of that existing tariff burden. The Canadian government's position entering the July 1st review deadline is documented. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has stated consistently that Canada wants a comprehensive CUSMA renewal, covering all sectors, not a piecemeal bilateral arrangement that allows the United States to negotiate separately with Canada and Mexico, while applying maximum pressure to each individually. The Mexico trade mission to Canada in early May 2026, which involved 240 companies and more than 1,800 business meetings in Toronto and Montreal, was explicitly described by both governments as preparation for joint engagement in the CUSMA review. Canada and Mexico have both maintained that the trilateral structure of the agreement must be preserved, rather than allowing the review to become two separate bilateral negotiations where American leverage is concentrated against each party individually. The American proposal's internal logic is that higher US content requirements would accelerate reshoring of auto parts manufacturing into the United States, bringing jobs and investment into states whose political constituencies the administration needs. The auto sector employs approximately 1 million workers in US manufacturing directly, with an estimated 7.7 million jobs across the full supply chain, including dealers, parts, distributors, and service operations. Those employment numbers and their geographic distribution across Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Alabama define the political stakes of the automotive content debate for both parties in Washington. The practical commercial tension embedded in the American proposal is the one that trade, lawyers, and auto industry analysts identified immediately. If US-specific content requirements are set high enough that compliance requires substantial supply chain restructuring, some automakers may calculate that paying tariffs on non-compliant vehicles is commercially preferable to the capital investment and operational complexity of meeting the new thresholds. If that calculation prevails across a significant portion of the industry, the net effect would be more vehicles subject to tariffs rather than more vehicles with higher US content, precisely the opposite of the stated policy objective. Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada, stated the Canadian industry's position directly. The ask at the beginning of these things is always ambitious. We need to land in a spot where we're creating more value and more jobs, and that means a North American supply chain. That's the goal. His framing North American supply chain rather than US-only supply chain captures the fundamental disagreement between the American proposal and the Canadian and Mexican negotiating positions. The existing framework creates incentives for North American sourcing collectively. The proposed change creates incentives specifically for American sourcing, with Canadian and Mexican production treated as commercially less desirable under the new threshold structure. The July 1st deadline is not a hard endpoint that ends the review if no agreement is reached. CUSMA includes provisions for the agreement to continue operating on a year-by-year review basis if the parties do not agree to a 16-year extension following the 2026 review. Operating under annual review creates sustained uncertainty for investment decisions across the automotive supply chain. Capital expenditures for new model platforms, factory expansions, and tooling investments are planned on 5 to 10-year horizons, not 1-year horizons. The prospect of the agreement operating in annual review mode, rather than receiving a 16-year extension, is itself a form of commercial disruption that affects investment decisions regardless of what specific content rules are. Eventually agreed upon, Canada's auto sector produced approximately 1.4 million vehicles in 2025, generating significant employment in Ontario's manufacturing communities. The Windsor-Detroit corridor handles approximately $126 billion in annual freight value, the largest bilateral trade corridor in North America. Automotive sector disruption from the CUSMA content negotiations does not affect only the three governments negotiating the agreement. It affects the workers, suppliers, logistics companies, and communities whose livelihoods are organized around the integrated continental manufacturing system that CUSMA was designed to sustain. The formal CUSMA review period has now officially begun with the American automotive content proposal on the table.